Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're listening to the Bible Forum. We're here every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just for you. We talk about life. We talk about the Bible. We put the two together. We talk about life from a biblical perspective. We solve all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. Tonight I want to talk to you about America's social problems. Do we have a social problem? We have a serious, serious social problem. How do we fix it? Where did we get off the track? What is really going on? The moral issues are taking front and center on the stage of life. The presidential debates on CNN just the other day spent a significant amount of time discussing the social problems in the United States. There are very few days, very few weeks that go by without at least one daytime show highlighting one problem or another: date rape, teen pregnancy, drug abuse, violence in the home, bullying, the breakdown of the family structure, vulgar language, sexually explicit images. The list gets longer and longer and longer. Earlier this evening, I read to you from Paul's letter to Timothy, and he had a list that was longer than this one, and it included many of the things that we know today. The history of these United States is strewn with moral failures and abuses, and many of them are products of accepted social policy, the social polities of that day. Others resulted from immoral men who were not fully constrained nor controlled. Someone here recently, and it happens quite often, it was Bernie Sanders at Liberty University, told the gathered students, in case they didn't know, that America was actually founded as a racist nation. That's not entirely true, but there were certain racial elements in there, weren't there? And women didn't get a vote, did they? That's sexist. Of course, neither did anybody who didn't own property. So it wasn't they were pointing at black men or they were pointing at women. They were pointing at people who were not stakeholders. And I guess you can call that racism. That's what we call it today. They didn't call it that. And it's very hard. Go back to any time in the past, more than 100 years. And you'll find that people all over the world were living like that. We weren't unique. It was the species and what we knew. Do you realize that our racial policies largely grew out of our evolutionary thinking? Evolution supported the idea of a racial inequality. We had a whole system growing up around that, even up into the early 20th century. Men are not nice, and they do awful things. But a nation is like a child that is born and then grows into adulthood. With all the history of that child, a child who was not fully aware, not fully developed, not fully capable. A child having struggled through the crucible of their teen years, their young adult years, the early 20th century. But our nation, coming out of the roaring 20s, flappers, bootleg whiskey, and all the rest of it, Al Capone, fought 2 world wars, a police action in Korea, and were already engaged and another police action in Vietnam that became a war by the time most of us were aware of life at all. The 1970s were a watershed moment in the life of this country. It was in those days that we abandoned our monetary system in favor of fiat currency. The dollar you have in your pocket today is worth less than 8 cents in 1960 dollars. And we have an $18.3 trillion debt, a debt that has grown by 80%. It is 80% larger now than it was 7 years ago. America had been through all the turmoil of the 20th century by the time the 1970s came along. The men coming back from World War II had been through a depression. They just wanted to get to work, make money, and take care of their family, and they did. But one of the things they failed to do was to raise their children properly. They gave them too much. By the end of the 60s, moving into the 70s, as Vietnam was starting to taper off, rock music was starting to take control and drugs had entered into the system. Birth control pills became abortion on demand. Marijuana, LSD, were traded for heroin. God and the Bible were kicked out of school in the early 1970s. No-fault divorce ravaged the family, mothers going off to work, leaving children alone or in the care of others. The breakdown of the nuclear family left us without patterns and without traditions. The anarchy of college students in the late 60s and 70s and even 80s, the rebellion of teenagers. America had kicked the religious habit. We were going through our own cultural revolution, only we did it to ourselves. Statistics show a precipitous rise of every bad, dangerous, and destructive pattern marked in that one decade. Crime took off. Teen pregnancies took off. Drug abuse, divorce, alcoholism, the breakdown of the family unit, inflation. If you see them charted, every one of them are on a 45-degree angle going up over the next 2 decades. The teen pregnancy thing dropped off and leveled out. Not because people suddenly became moral, because we had better delivery systems and abortion and other things to keep the babies from being born. What's being ignored in all of this precipitous increase in what can only be called dangerous and destructive, is the moral component. What's the best treatment for drug abuse? Stop taking the drugs. What's the best treatment for alcoholism? Quit drinking. What about AIDS, violence, teen pregnancies, laziness, thievery, and just about any other behavior you can think of? They're all controllable. Stop them. Don't do them. It isn't a drug. It isn't a therapy. It's a behavior. But some people can't do this. It's not their fault. They were born this way. That's a new pathology. We can resolve our problems in this country, our moral problems, our mental health problems, our drug problems. We can resolve them all with a strong moral societal structure. A strong commitment to God. And you don't even have to be a Christian, just to his moral principles. A strong family structure, a strong moral value system, a strong commitment to the rule of law, and a strong sense of community, that I am responsible for the guy next door. It used to be that way. When I was a kid, if I went down the street and I turned over somebody's trash can, my mom knew before I got home. Everybody knew who you were. It was a neighborhood. And if they didn't know who you were, and you were out in their yard or near them doing something that you shouldn't have been doing, even if you were just picking on some other kid, some woman would come out there with a broom and beat you over the head and run you off, just like she was your mother. And nobody took her to jail. Nobody went home and told Mom what happened. Sure not Dad. Without all of these controls, society is not going to survive very much longer. It is already decadent. It is already diseased. It is already destructive. Our own society is coarsening at a rate beyond anything we could have imagined 50 years ago. There was a world of difference between the 1940s teenager and the 1970s. And now, 50 years later, it's the Barbary Coast with little pockets of decency. If babies are being left in kennels for 40 plus hours a week for someone else to imprint and take care of, and young children are put into after-school programs, while teenagers are left to raise themselves and go home and watch cable TV with pay-per-view channels of one sort or another. And if 10-year-olds are living as though they're adult and parents are treating them that way, giving them choices, where do you think all that's taking us? And if I disagree, or if you disagree with me, well, you've committed high treason, haven't you? To take what I've just said and go into your school system or go into a social system somewhere and talk to them like this, they think you were nuts. It is moral, social bigotry. That's what you're espousing. If family consists of whatever I think it is, and values are whatever the gang says they are, what's the next generation going to be like? If I can kill babies in the womb for no reason other than they are in the way, if we can jump in and out of marriages instead of being forced to make it work, what future does that institution have? The founders wrote extensively and exhaustively on the nature of humanity and the lessons of history and the failures of preceding generations and governments. They also wrote on moral issues, and they did so understanding that unless an individual had an eternal, external reason for doing right, they probably wouldn't. They crafted what has been called the Great Experiment around what they learned from history. They learned that man is prone to wander from the high standards he once held. Whatever the height was, it's usually down from there. That human beings need to be governed in order to avoid social chaos and destruction. That too much government stifles individual and corporate growth. That not enough government leads to anarchy and chaos in the group as well as in the individual. That men need to acknowledge God in order to avoid chaos. That men cannot be trusted to govern themselves or others without suitable checks and balances, rewards and punishments. that the rule of law must be supreme or men will become tyrants, that the family is critical to the health and success of any society. And so the question is, which of our presidential candidates believes this enough to do something to change the status quo? Which individual voter knows enough to vote for the changes that are critical to our survival? Some are voting because this guy's going to fix the money system. He knows all about money. He's going to fix the money. This guy's going to fix our foreign policy system, and we're going to be safer. Who out there knows how to vote for character, for values, American values, the founders' values? Which American cares enough to stand up for God, for family, for ultimate and absolute right, no matter what? And what drug exists that will soothe our minds and our hearts when we don't? Our solution is not drugs. Our solution is family values, old-fashioned American values. And without them, we will perish.